The dusty streets of Tombstone Creek had seen many secrets buried beneath their weathered planks, but none quite like the one that would unravel on that scorching August afternoon in 1883. Marshal Jake Thompson had always prided himself on reading people like open books, a skill that kept him alive in a town where death wore many faces and trust was a luxury few could afford. But when the stagecoach rolled into town carrying what appeared to be the most beautiful woman he had ever laid eyes upon, something stirred in his chest that had nothing to do with his lawman instincts and everything to do with the loneliness that had been eating at his soul for far too long. Sarah Mitchell stepped down from that dust-covered coach with the grace of a lady born to finer things, her emerald dress catching the harsh desert sun like captured starlight. Her face was a masterpiece of delicate features framed by auburn curls that seemed to dance with each gentle breeze, and when she smiled at the gathered townspeople, Jake felt his heart skip in ways he thought were reserved for much younger men. She had traveled from Charleston, she claimed, seeking a fresh start after losing her family to yellow fever, and the story tugged at every heartstring in a town filled with people running from their own ghosts. Within weeks, Jake found himself doing something he never thought possible. He was courting a woman with the intention of making her his wife. Sarah was everything he had dreamed of in those lonely nights when the howling wind reminded him of his solitude. She was cultured, speaking of books and music with a passion that made his rough edges feel smoother, and she possessed a kindness that seemed to heal the wounded souls who crossed her path. The widow Peterson claimed Sarah had helped deliver her baby when the doctor was 3 towns over dealing with a gunshot wound, and old Charlie at the general store swore she had talked down a drunk cowboy from starting a fight that could have left half the town in ruins. The courtship progressed with all the proper decorum expected in their small community, though Jake noticed peculiar things that he attributed to Sarah being from a more refined background than the frontier women he was accustomed to. She never seemed to sweat despite the brutal heat, always appeared fresh and composed even after long days helping around town, and possessed a knowledge of medicine and practical skills that seemed unusual for a woman of her supposed breeding. When he mentioned these observations to his deputy, Tom Bradley, the younger man just laughed and said Jake was overthinking things because he was nervous about finally finding love. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in October, when the brutal summer heat would give way to the crisp air that made desert living bearable. The entire town threw themselves into preparations, with Sarah graciously accepting help from the local women while maintaining a mysterious air about her past that only made her more intriguing. She spoke little of Charleston, deflecting questions with gentle smiles and changes of subject that were so skillfully executed that most people didn't realize they had learned nothing new about their soon-to-be neighbor. Jake was so besotted that he barely noticed these conversational dances, focused instead on the way Sarah's laugh sounded like silver bells in the wind and how her presence seemed to bring peace to his restless spirit. He had been a lawman for 15 years, had tracked killers across 3 territories, and had developed instincts that had kept him breathing when lesser men had been planted in Boot Hill, but love had made him blind to the very signs that would have sent alarm bells ringing through his professional mind under any other circumstances. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect weather that made even the most cynical residents believe that good things could happen in their little corner of the world. Sarah looked radiant in her white dress, borrowed from the preacher's wife and altered to fit her slender frame perfectly, and Jake felt like the luckiest man west of the Mississippi as they stood before Reverend Matthews and the assembled townspeople. The ceremony proceeded without incident, with traditional vows exchanged and rings placed on fingers amid tears of joy from the gathered crowd. It was during the reception, as the sun began to set and cast long shadows across the town square where tables had been set up for the celebration, that Jake experienced his first moment of genuine confusion about his new bride. Sarah had excused herself to freshen up, and Jake was accepting congratulations from his fellow citizens when he heard a voice from the direction of the church calling his name. The voice was deeper than Sarah's usual melodic tones, rougher around the edges in a way that seemed impossible for the refined woman he had just married. Jake turned toward the sound, expecting to see Sarah perhaps calling to him from a distance, but what he saw instead stopped his heart cold in his chest. There was Sarah, standing in the doorway of the church, but something was fundamentally different about her posture. The way she held her shoulders, the manner in which she moved as she approached him. When she opened her mouth to speak again, that same deeper voice emerged, and Jake felt the world tilt on its axis as he whispered to himself the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The voice that emerged from Sarah's lips belonged to no woman Jake had ever encountered, and as she spoke, telling him they needed to talk privately, he noticed other changes that his love-addled brain had somehow missed or explained away during their courtship. Her hands, while slender and graceful, bore calluses in places that suggested familiarity with rope and leather rather than needlework and piano keys. Her knowledge of horses and firearms, which he had attributed to growing up on a plantation, suddenly seemed far too detailed and practical for someone who claimed to have lived a sheltered life. As they walked away from the celebration toward the privacy of their new home, Jake's lawman instincts finally began to override his romantic feelings, and he started cataloging every strange detail he had overlooked during their whirlwind courtship. Sarah's refusal to let him see her without her corset, her insistence on privacy during her daily routines, her uncanny ability to disappear for hours at a time without adequate explanation, and most disturbing of all, the way she seemed to know things about local criminal activity that she should have had no way of discovering. Inside their small house, lit only by the flickering light of oil lamps, Sarah turned to face him with an expression that was equal parts relief and terror, and when she spoke again in that impossible voice, she began to unravel a story that would challenge everything Jake thought he knew about truth, identity, and the nature of love itself. The woman he had married was not Sarah Mitchell from Charleston, had never been to Charleston, and was not, in the conventional sense that Jake understood such things, a woman at all. The person standing before him was Samuel Mitchell, wanted in 3 territories for bank robbery, cattle rustling, and the murder of 2 federal marshals, who had been living as a woman for the past 8 months while evading capture. The transformation had begun as pure survival strategy, a way to hide in plain sight while the law searched for a dangerous male outlaw, but had evolved into something far more complex when Samuel found himself genuinely caring for the people of Tombstone Creek and, against all logic and expectation, falling in love with the very marshal who was supposed to be hunting him. Jake stood frozen as this revelation washed over him, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun before stopping, as he realized the impossibility of his situation. The person he loved, had married, had pledged his life to, was not only living a lie but was also one of the most wanted criminals in the territory. Every kiss they had shared, every tender moment, every promise of their future together had been built on a foundation of deception so complete that Jake felt like he was drowning in the enormity of it all. Samuel, still wearing Sarah's wedding dress but now speaking in his natural voice, explained how the disguise had started as a desperate gamble when federal marshals had gotten too close to his trail near Phoenix. He had stolen women's clothing from a laundry line, learned to walk and talk like a lady by watching saloon girls and respectable women alike, and had practiced the deception on travelers and in small towns until he could maintain the illusion for extended periods. The plan had been to lay low in Tombstone Creek for a few weeks before moving on, but the kindness of the townspeople and Jake's obvious loneliness had complicated everything. As Samuel spoke, Jake found himself studying the face he thought he knew so well, seeing now the subtle signs of masculinity that had been hidden by clever makeup, careful posturing, and his own willingness to see what he wanted to see. The jaw was perhaps too strong for a woman, the hands too large despite their graceful movements, and the voice, now that he was truly listening, carried undertones that no amount of practice could completely disguise. The most disturbing realization was that even now, knowing the truth, Jake could still see the Sarah he had fallen in love with in Samuel's features and mannerisms. The story that emerged over the next hour was one of desperation, survival, and ultimately, an unexpected transformation that had surprised no one more than Samuel himself. Born into poverty in Missouri, Samuel had turned to crime as a young man when legitimate work proved insufficient to support his sick mother and younger siblings. The robberies had started small, targeting travelers and isolated homesteads, but had escalated when he fell in with a gang of hardened criminals who taught him that violence was often the most efficient solution to life's problems. The murders that had put the federal marshals on his trail had not been intentional, Samuel insisted, but had occurred during a bank robbery gone wrong when the local sheriff had tried to play hero and Samuel's partner had panicked and started shooting. Samuel had returned fire to protect himself, and when the smoke cleared, 2 lawmen lay dead and Samuel found himself transformed from a small-time outlaw into one of the most wanted men in the American West. The bounty on his head had grown to $5,000, enough money to ensure that every lawman, bounty hunter, and desperate citizen would be watching for him. Living as Sarah had initially been purely practical, a way to move through the world without constantly looking over his shoulder. But the months in Tombstone Creek had changed something fundamental in Samuel's understanding of himself and what he wanted from life. The kindness of the townspeople, the simple pleasure of being accepted and valued, and most confusingly of all, the genuine feelings he had developed for Jake had shown him a different way of existing that he had never imagined possible. For the first time in his adult life, Samuel had felt truly safe, truly at peace, and the prospect of giving that up seemed almost unbearable. Jake listened to this confession with a mixture of professional duty and personal anguish that threatened to tear him apart. His badge demanded that he arrest Samuel immediately, transport him to the territorial capital for trial, and collect the substantial bounty that would solve his own financial problems for years to come. His heart, however, was screaming that the person before him was still somehow the Sarah he had fallen in love with, that the gentleness and kindness he had witnessed could not have been entirely fabricated, and that turning in the person who had brought him such happiness would be a betrayal of everything he held dear. The practical problems were overwhelming. Their marriage, performed before God and the community, was built on a lie so fundamental that it called into question not only its legality but its very reality. How could Jake face the townspeople who had celebrated with them, who had welcomed Sarah into their hearts and homes, and explain that they had all been deceived by a wanted criminal? How could he continue to serve as their marshal knowing that he had been so thoroughly fooled by someone he should have recognized as a threat to their safety and security? More disturbing still was the realization that his feelings for Samuel, despite everything, had not simply vanished with the revelation of the truth. The person sitting across from him in the lamplight was still someone who had shown compassion to the widow Peterson, had helped old Charlie with his inventory, had brought laughter and music to a town that had known too little of either. The deception was unforgivable, but the actions, the kindness, the love that Samuel had shown to him and the community seemed genuine in ways that Jake's professional experience told him were nearly impossible to fake convincingly over such an extended period. As the night wore on and the sounds of celebration from the town square gradually faded, Jake found himself facing the most difficult decision of his life. Samuel sat quietly, having finished his confession, waiting for Jake to determine both their fates. The wanted posters in Jake's office promised that Samuel Mitchell was armed and extremely dangerous, but the person before him seemed small and vulnerable, someone who had found something precious and was terrified of losing it. The disconnect between the criminal described by the federal marshals and the person Jake had come to know and love seemed impossible to reconcile. Dawn was breaking over the desert when Jake finally spoke, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. He could not, he said, continue to live a lie, but neither could he simply pretend that the months with Sarah had meant nothing or that the feelings they had shared could be dismissed as mere deception. Samuel had committed serious crimes, had killed federal marshals, and represented a genuine danger to the community that Jake had sworn to protect. But the person who had lived among them as Sarah had also brought healing, joy, and love to people who desperately needed all three. The solution Jake proposed was as unconventional as their entire situation, born from his desperate need to find some middle ground between his duty as a lawman and his love for the person who had become the center of his world. Samuel would leave Tombstone Creek immediately, disappearing as completely as Sarah Mitchell had appeared, but Jake would not pursue him or alert the federal authorities to his presence in their territory. In exchange, Samuel would promise to abandon his criminal activities forever, to find some way to make an honest living far from the reaches of his former life, and to never return to endanger the people of Tombstone Creek who had shown him such undeserved kindness. It was not a perfect solution, and both men knew that it satisfied neither justice nor love completely, but it was the only path they could find that honored both Jake's responsibility to his community and the genuine connection they had forged during those impossible months. Samuel would take nothing with him except the clothes Jake provided and enough money to reach the next territory, leaving behind the life of Sarah Mitchell as completely as if she had never existed. Jake would tell the townspeople that Sarah had received word of a family emergency back east and had been forced to leave immediately, a story that would raise questions but would eventually be accepted by people who had their own secrets to protect. The farewell was brief and devastating. Two people who had found love in the most unlikely circumstances being forced apart by the weight of truth and the demands of justice. Samuel, dressed now in men's clothing that hung loose on his frame, looked like a stranger to Jake despite the familiar features, while Jake felt like he was watching his heart walk away into the desert dawn. They did not embrace, did not make promises they could not keep, did not pretend that their paths might cross again under happier circumstances. Instead, they simply looked at each other with the knowledge that they had shared something rare and precious that would never be repeated or forgotten. As Samuel disappeared into the morning haze, Jake turned back toward town to begin the difficult process of explaining Sarah's sudden departure to people who had welcomed her as family. The lies would be easier to tell than the truth, but they would still taste like ashes in his mouth, and he knew that part of him would always be watching the horizon, hoping against hope that the person he had loved might somehow find a way to return to him. The wedding ring on his finger felt like a weight he would carry forever, a reminder of the day when love and deception had become so intertwined that he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Years later, Jake would receive occasional reports of a quiet school teacher in California who bore a striking resemblance to someone he had once known. But he never investigated these rumors, preferring to believe that Samuel had found the honest life he had promised to seek. The people of Tombstone Creek eventually stopped asking about Sarah Mitchell, accepting Jake's explanation that some wounds were too private to share, and life continued with the steady rhythm of a frontier town growing into something more civilized and permanent. But on quiet evenings when the desert wind carried whispers of the past, Jake would touch his wedding ring and remember a voice that had belonged to no woman he had ever known, and wonder if love could truly exist when built on a foundation of lies, or if what they had shared had been something else entirely, something for which the English language had no adequate words. The decades that followed brought changes to Tombstone Creek that Jake could never have imagined during those early days when the town was little more than a collection of wooden buildings and desperate dreams. The railroad arrived in 1891, bringing with it merchants, families, and the steady march of civilization that transformed their rough frontier settlement into a proper town with brick buildings, gas streetlights, and even a small opera house where traveling performers would stop to entertain the growing population. Jake remained as marshal through all these changes, his hair turning silver and his face bearing the deep lines that came from years of squinting into the desert sun and carrying the weight of secrets that grew heavier with each passing season. The townspeople respected him as a man who had kept their community safe during its most vulnerable years, but they also sensed something melancholy in his character that he never fully explained, a sadness that seemed to deepen rather than fade as the years accumulated around him like dust on an old photograph. He never married again, despite the gentle encouragements of well-meaning friends and the arrival of several unmarried women who would have been suitable matches for a man of his standing and reputation. When pressed about his continued bachelorhood, Jake would smile sadly and say that he had loved once, deeply and completely, and that some men were only meant to experience that kind of connection once in their lifetime. The explanation satisfied most people, though a few of the older residents remembered Sarah Mitchell and wondered if her mysterious departure had something to do with Jake's reluctance to open his heart again. The wanted posters for Samuel Mitchell gradually faded from Jake's office wall, replaced by notices for newer criminals and more current threats. But Jake kept one copy locked in his desk drawer along with a small pressed flower that had fallen from Sarah's bouquet on their wedding day. Sometimes, late at night when the town was quiet and his duties were finished, he would take out these mementos and try to make sense of the impossible months when his life had been turned upside down by someone whose very existence challenged everything he thought he knew about truth, identity, and the nature of love itself. In 1897, Jake received a letter with no return address, postmarked from San Francisco, written in a careful hand that he recognized despite the years that had passed since he had last seen it. The letter was brief and circumspect, speaking in general terms about a life lived quietly and honestly, about work as a clerk in a shipping office, and about the profound gratitude that would always exist for a lawman who had chosen compassion over duty during a moment that could have ended very differently. The writer mentioned watching sunsets over the Pacific Ocean and finding peace in the anonymity of a large city where the past could truly be left behind. Most importantly, the letter assured Jake that the promise made that morning in the desert had been kept faithfully, that no crimes had been committed since leaving Arizona territory, and that the person who had once been Sarah Mitchell had found ways to make amends for past wrongs through quiet acts of charity and service to others who found themselves lost or desperate. The letter ended with words of love that were careful not to specify the exact nature of that affection. acknowledging that what they had shared defied easy categorization but had been real and transformative for both of them. Jake read that letter so many times that the paper became soft and fragile in his hands, and he wrote several responses that he never sent, unsure whether reaching back across the years would bring comfort or only reopen wounds that had never properly healed. Eventually, he decided that some connections were meant to exist in memory rather than in ongoing correspondence, and he placed the letter in his desk drawer alongside the other keepsakes from that impossible time, treasures that no one else would ever see or understand. The new century arrived with celebrations and hopes for a brighter future, and Tombstone Creek continued to grow and prosper under Jake's steady leadership. He trained younger deputies, helped establish the town's first proper courthouse, and became something of an elder statesman whose advice was sought on matters both official and personal. Children who had been born after Sarah's brief residence grew up hearing whispered stories about the mysterious woman who had captured their marshal's heart, and then vanished like a mirage. Tales that grew more romantic and less accurate with each telling. In 1903, Jake suffered a mild heart attack that forced him to consider retirement and the question of what he would do with the remainder of his life. He was only 58 years old, still strong enough to perform his duties, but the episode had reminded him that his time was finite and that he had spent the last 20 years living in the shadow of a love that had been both the most real and the most illusory experience of his existence. His deputy, Tom Bradley, now a mature man with a family of his own, had proven himself capable of taking over as marshal, and Jake began to seriously consider stepping down from the position that had defined his adult life. It was during this period of contemplation that Jake received news that would change everything once again. A traveling preacher passing through town mentioned meeting a school teacher in Oakland, California, who had asked specifically about Tombstone Creek and whether Marshal Thompson was still serving there. The description the preacher provided was vague, but something in his manner suggested that the inquiry had been more than casual curiosity, and Jake felt his heart begin to race in ways that reminded him uncomfortably of his recent medical troubles. The preacher had been invited to speak at the school's graduation ceremony, and he described the teacher as someone of obvious intelligence and compassion who had created a remarkable program for helping immigrant children learn English and adapt to their new country. What struck him most, the preacher said, was the teacher's profound knowledge of frontier life and an ability to tell stories about the Old West that captivated students who had never been more than a few miles from the Pacific coastline. The teacher had declined to attend the social gathering after the ceremony, pleading other commitments, but had pressed the preacher for detailed information about life in Arizona Territory with an intensity that seemed oddly personal. Jake listened to this account with growing excitement and terror, unsure whether he was being offered a glimpse of the person he had never stopped loving or was simply allowing his imagination to create connections where none existed. The description could fit many people, and 20 years was long enough for someone to change beyond recognition. But something in the preacher's words resonated with memories that Jake had carefully preserved despite the passage of time. He found himself considering something he had never thought possible: leaving Tombstone Creek to search for answers to questions he had carried for 2 decades. The decision to travel to California was not made lightly or quickly, but as summer turned to autumn in 1903, Jake realized that he would never find peace unless he knew with certainty whether the person who had been Sarah Mitchell was still alive and, if so, whether the feelings they had shared had endured the test of time and distance. He arranged for Tom Bradley to assume his duties temporarily, ostensibly for health reasons, and booked passage on the railroad that would carry him farther from home than he had traveled since his arrival in Arizona Territory as a young man. The train journey to California gave Jake ample time to consider what he hoped to accomplish and what he feared he might discover. The person he sought might have died years earlier, might have moved on to yet another identity and location, or might simply have no desire to resurrect connections to a past that had been deliberately left behind. Even if he found the school teacher the preacher had described, there was no guarantee that it would be Samuel, and no certainty that Samuel would want to see the lawman who represented both salvation and the loss of the life he had built as Sarah Mitchell. Oakland in 1903 was a bustling city that bore no resemblance to the frontier towns where Jake had spent his entire adult life, and navigating its streets and customs made him feel like a visitor from another world entirely. He found the school easily enough, a substantial brick building that served the children of immigrants from dozens of countries, but approaching it required courage that had nothing to do with facing down armed criminals and everything to do with confronting the possibility that his greatest hope might also become his greatest disappointment. The teacher he sought was indeed there, older now and bearing the marks of age and experience that 2 decades bring to anyone's life, but still recognizably the person who had once lived as Sarah Mitchell in a small Arizona town. The recognition was mutual and immediate, though both stood frozen for long moments, unsure how to bridge the gap between past and present, between the people they had been and the people they had become. Samuel looked well, healthy and prosperous, with the bearing of someone who had found purpose and contentment in work that mattered, and Jake felt a surge of relief that the promise of an honest life had been kept so completely. Their conversation, when it finally began, was careful and tentative. 2 people who had shared the most intimate connection possible now discovering that they were also strangers who had lived entirely separate lives for 20 years. Samuel had indeed become a teacher, first in small mountain towns where questions were rarely asked about one's past, then gradually moving to larger communities as confidence and credentials accumulated. The work had been fulfilling in ways that surprised someone who had spent years taking what belonged to others, and the opportunity to help children build better futures had provided a sense of redemption that no amount of money or adventure had ever offered. Jake learned that Samuel had never married, had never formed another romantic attachment, but had built a rich life filled with friends, colleagues, and students who provided different but genuine forms of love and connection. The loneliness that had driven Samuel to crime in his youth had been replaced by a sense of belonging to a community that valued his contributions and respected his dedication. It was, Samuel admitted, a good life, perhaps even a happy one, though it had always been shadowed by memories of a brief period when love had seemed possible and a different future had beckoned like a mirage in the desert. As they walked through Oakland streets, talking carefully about their separate journeys through the intervening years, both men struggled with the question of what this reunion meant and what, if anything, could be built from the ashes of their impossible past. They were no longer the people who had fallen in love in Tombstone Creek, no longer the desperate criminal and the lonely lawman who had found each other across a gulf of deception and duty. They were middle-aged men who had built successful lives on opposite sides of the country, with responsibilities and commitments that could not easily be abandoned for the sake of romantic nostalgia. Yet something remained between them, a connection that had survived 20 years of separation and the knowledge that their original relationship had been built on lies. It was not the passionate love of their youth, but something deeper and more mature, an understanding that they had shared something rare and precious that had shaped both their lives in fundamental ways. They had each become better people because of their brief time together, and that transformation seemed to matter more than the deception that had made it possible. Jake extended his stay in California, and he and Samuel began to explore the possibility of building a new relationship based on truth rather than necessity, affection rather than desperation, and mutual respect rather than romantic illusion. It was a delicate process that required them to acknowledge the people they had become while honoring the connection they had shared, and there were moments when the weight of the past seemed too heavy to overcome. But there were also moments when they glimpsed the possibility of a future together, not as martial and mysterious bride, but as 2 people who had found each other again against impossible odds. The story of Jake Thompson and Samuel Mitchell, the lawman and the outlaw who had fallen in love across the boundaries of law and identity, ended not with dramatic confrontations or tragic sacrifices, but with the quiet decision of 2 middle-aged men to build something new from the fragments of their shared past. Jake resigned his position as Marshal of Tombstone Creek and moved to California, where he found work as a security consultant for the growing number of businesses that needed someone with his experience and judgment. Samuel continued teaching, but they bought a small house together where they could create the life that had been impossible 20 years earlier. They lived quietly and carefully, 2 men whose friendship raised no eyebrows in a city where privacy was easier to maintain than it had ever been in a small frontier town. Their neighbors knew them as retired professionals who kept a neat garden, attended community events, and could be counted on to help when assistance was needed. Only they knew the full truth of their story, the impossible journey that had brought them from a wedding built on lies to a partnership founded on acceptance, forgiveness, and a love that had somehow survived everything that should have destroyed it. In his final years, Jake would often sit on their porch watching the California sunset and marveling at the strange turns his life had taken. He had begun as a young man seeking justice in a lawless land, had found love with someone whose very existence challenged his understanding of truth and identity, and had ended as half of a partnership that defied every convention of their time while somehow feeling like the most natural thing in the world. The wanted posters had long since yellowed and been forgotten. The crimes had been buried under decades of honest living, and what remained was